have to make, if you're making a movie as opposed to real science fiction, you have to make allowances sometimes. So those are my favorite characters. They're always the ones, I don't want to say intellectuals, they're the ones who think things through and solve problems without blowing something up. I don't know how else to put it. Yes, here.
We'll be hearing more from Philip Links.
I'm talking about the Commonwealth Books and character of mine named Philip Links, also known as Flinks. We're having a very difficult time with Del Rey right now. The whole book industry is in a state of flux. Everybody in the book business is now as terrified as everybody in the film business always has been. Because as William Goldman, the screenwriter of The Princess Bride and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, said in his famous book about Hollywood, nobody knows anything. Well, that's where the book business is now. For many years, for many decades, the book business was set. You had an editor, the editor approved a book, approved a purchase. Now, with the advent of electronic publishing, everybody in New York is scared to death. Several of the people I worked with at Del Rey Ballantyne over the last couple of years left the publishing industry in New York. And you know where they all went? They went to Amazon. They all moved to Seattle. Because what they're really scared about is not the whole idea of ebooks, although that's turned the whole business upside down by itself. What they're scared of is that Stephen King will decide to have Amazon Publishing publish his next book in ebook form and skip New York publishing altogether. And if you want a book on paper, they'll do print on demand for you. I work with a company called Open Road Media out of back east, and that's what they do. Their principal concern is publishing ebooks. But if you want a book on paper, hardbound or softbound, they'll do a print on demand for you. It costs a little bit more because the print run is small, but you can get it. You can get both versions. If nobody needs the publishers of New York, they're all going to go out of business. And I won't go on and on about this, but just to show you why they're so frightened in New York and why they can't compete. General average royalties on a hardbound book, what they do is they give you an advance, say $20,000. The book costs $20. The advance is 10%. It's an advance against royalties. What that means is at 10% per book, which would be $2 per book, the book has to make back the $20,000 advance. And if it does that, then you start getting the $2 per book. Okay? If you go with an ebook publisher, whether it's Amazon or Open Road or somebody, the author gets 70%. Now you get no advance usually. But that means from the first book that sells, say it's a $20 book, you get 70% of that. And there's generally some cost for promotion and publicity, but that's a heck of a deal for an author. And there's no way traditional publishers can compete with that, because ebook publishers have no shipping costs, no printing costs, no binding costs, no warehouse costs. They have no excess inventory that has to be pulped. It's completely changing the way books are published. And they're all scared to death. So, had a lot of trouble trying to convince Del Rey. They have offered. I mean, I have a book outlined in the series that you mentioned. I'm all ready to write it, but they don't want to pay anything for it unless they can get the ebook rights for virtually nothing. So what they can do is go publish 500 copies of the book and then just sit back and try and collect on ebooks, where my royalty would be 10 or 12% or something. So, you know, authors aren't stupid. People are rising up to it. I love books on paper as much as anybody else, but it's still a business. That's kind of a roundabout answer to your question, but probably. But when, I couldn't begin to say.
I wait eagerly.
Thank you. Yes.
I was just wondering, wanted to elaborate on your comment about Hollywood not knowing anything about science fiction. I was kind of curious if you had more to say about that.
The people who run the film business in Hollywood aren't science fiction fans. They're mystery fans, they're comic chase fans, they're cheap comedy fans, they're horror movie fans, because these are films that make money. Science fiction, and they're fantasy fans, because fantasy is easy. Everybody's grown up with fairy tales. But science fiction presupposes a certain amount of curiosity about how the world works, about science. Doesn't mean you have to have a degree in physics. Doesn't mean you even have to have gone to physics class. But you have to have an interest in those things. And that's why science fiction will always remain a minor component of publishing, too. It's why something like Game of Thrones will always outsell something like Childhood's End 20 or 30 or 40 to 1. That's just the way the world is. They don't understand science fiction. They are completely baffled by it. They have no idea. The story I told about the Star Trek movie. You know, George Lucas wanted originally to make Flash Gordon, remake Flash Gordon, couldn't get the rights. So he made Star Wars instead. George grew up reading science fiction. He understands science fiction, whether you like his version of it or not. So did Spielberg. These people do. Some actors do too. Consider how many science fiction films Will Smith has been in. You know that Will Smith is a science fiction fan, or he wouldn't be in all these movies. He gets offered plenty of other movies. Science fiction is difficult. People in Hollywood don't like difficult things. They like simple things. There's a famous story about how, I think it was MGM, kept one guy around. He was a very clever concept guy. This is in the 30s. And he wasn't much of a writer, but he was great with concepts. See, that's what, you don't sell a story in Hollywood, you sell a concept. And this guy, his job was just to wander around the studio lot and get ideas, and wander around the writer's building, because at that time you had to be on the lot if you were a writer. You couldn't write at home. Except somebody once asked William Faulkner, who had been hired by the studio, you know, Faulkner said, look, could I work from home? And they said, well, okay. And somebody ran into the writer's building one day and said, where's Faulkner? And he had gone back to Mississippi because he was working at home. And this guy wandered in one day and he said, Clark Gable, Spencer Tracy, Earthquake, San Francisco. That's how the whole movie, which was a very expensive movie, came about. The movie San Francisco. That's Hollywood. They don't understand science fiction. The people who make good science fiction films are not part of the Hollywood establishment. The people who made The Matrix, Roddenberry is an exception, no question about it. But a lot of it is derivative. A lot of it is with Spielberg and Lucas, these people who understand science fiction. But they come from outside the establishment, generally. Yes?
Could you talk about the characters, Leah and Luke, in Splinter of the Mind's Eye, of where it differs from...
Yes. How many have read Splinter of the Mind's Eye? All right. There is a certain frisson between Luke and Leia in the book that doesn't exist between the characters in the rest of the books. At the time I wrote the book, remember I was given no guidance. I was just said, go home and write a novel. And George approved it. He liked it. This tells us that George had not decided at this point that Luke and Leia were to be brother and sister. And it's not just me in the book. So there's a little flirtation. I had the impression from watching Star Wars, and before that, because I hadn't seen the film before I wrote the novelization, or Splinter, that they were love interests. I had no idea that they were siblings. There's the famous scene in the film where, you know, the princess gives him a kiss for luck before they swing across the open trench. That wasn't a very sisterly kiss. And there is a cut shot. For those of you who love to research these things, it's available online. There's a cut scene from Empire Strikes Back. So this goes on through at least the second film, where there's a rather steamy, you know, embrace scene between Luke and Leia in The Empire Strikes Back, which George cut out because at that point he had decided they were going to be brothers. A lot of the stuff was made up as it goes along. The one thing none of us will ever get over, and believe me, I'm a real fan and friend of George Lucas, is making Darth Vader Luke's father. People to this day just don't buy that. You just don't take Hitler and redeem him on his deathbed. Right? And this guy's killed tens of millions of people, and suddenly he's a good guy because he's Luke's father. It's just, stuff gets made up as it goes along. It's very difficult to write sequels. You're always thinking while you're writing a sequel, well, everybody knows these characters. How am I going to get them interested in another book about the same characters? It's a problem every writer has had. It's why Conan Doyle tried to kill off Sherlock Holmes. Sequels, prequels are even more difficult. But sequels are tough also. And it's a very difficult thing to pull off. I always thought that I would have made Darth Vader Luke's evil brother, who had really killed their father, but was masquerading as Luke's father. I mean,
that would work.
We've all done it. We've all done it. Yeah. With not just with Star Wars, but with lots of films. But nobody asked. So we have what we have. What are you going to do? Yeah. It'll be very interesting to see what Abrams does, because you see how he rebooted Star Trek. kind of change things around. He was able to go back earlier. He can't do that with Star Wars, obviously. He'll have to do something else, and I'm sure he will try to do something else. It's going to be very interesting to see what they do. Yes?
You had mentioned you recently novelized the Into the Darkness. I'm wondering.
No, I can't tell you that.
A lot of us saw Wrath of Khan yesterday. Was that a good thing, do you think?
I can't say anything about it. Prescott, good shot, good effort. The Prescott phone book is now this thick. When we moved here, it was this thick. It's now this thick. The Bible is this thick. Hollywood contract is this thick. So you cannot. I can't. Believe me, I would be a rich. I just sell it off, but I can't do that.
Nightfall, the Isaac Asimov story that was filmed at Kosanti and Arcosanti, because Palo just died. And lots of people don't know this, but the spaceship for, extra, what the hell, Close Encounters, that's a Palo salary design, straight off of the MIT sketch. We haven't seen the movie.
Yes. Gentleman's referring to a low-budget version of probably, what was once voted the most famous science fiction short story of all time, a story called Nightfall by Isaac Asimov. Asimov was a wonderful writer and a great man. He loved dirty puns. In fact, he wrote a book of dirty puns. He wrote books about everything. But he would never get on an airplane. One of the greatest writers of science fiction, he would never get on
Never had a film made of any of his stuff.
No, they've...
except Nightfall.
Foundation, which every year they run polls of science fiction fans and editors. What's the greatest science fiction story? Like they do with films when it's usually Citizen Kane. What's the greatest science fiction book of all time? And the top three are always, although the position changes, Dune, the Foundation trilogy, which is actually 3 books by Isaac Asimov, which is mostly talk, which is one reason why it hasn't been filmed, and Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. Give you another example of how Hollywood works with science fiction. Childhood's End is about the next step up in human evolution. Now you can imagine going into a studio now and trying to pitch that as a story idea. I want to make a film about the next step up in human evolution. Well, is there a car chase in it? Are there girls in it? Can we make the hero, that's the way it works. It's really the way it works. Childhood's End, which came out in 1955, written by Arthur C. Clarke, who also wrote 2001: Space Odyssey, came out in 1955, was immediately optioned by a very young Arthur P. Jacobs, the man who later went on to make Planet of the Apes. It's still under option, more than half a century later, and they still haven't made it, because they can't figure out how to make a commercial version of it. It's not a commercial story. It is a beautiful, what they call sense of wonder story, but it is not a commercial Hollywood project. It will take somebody like a Spielberg who says, I want to make this movie. How do movies get made? When somebody like Spielberg says, I want to make this movie, that's how they get made. Or it will take somebody to underwrite it who really believes in the book. Or it will take somebody in Europe. But it's not going to be made in Hollywood. It's just not. Although Morgan Freeman, another big science fiction fan, has a very nice television show that some of you may have seen called Through the Wormhole. He has the option on Rendezvous with Rama, which is another great book by Clarke, and he's been trying to get that made for years and years and years. So even somebody like Morgan Freeman has trouble getting something made, because if you take something like Rendezvous with Rama and you present it to people in Hollywood and they say, what's it about? It's about a gigantic alien spaceship that comes into the solar system and we go and explore it and then it leaves. That's not your standard Hollywood ending. And that's fixable. You could do something.